It was 9 o'clock on a Friday night in October, and I had one hand on the light switch when somebody knocked on the shop door. Through the glass, I could see a woman under the street lamp in a gray wool coat, a flat gray box tucked against her ribs like a schoolbook, her breath showing in the cold. Thea rain had come through earlier and the sidewalk was still shining. I opened the door about 8 inches and said, "We close at 9. She didn't step back. She looked at me the way you look at a stubborn latch, with a kind of patience that isn't really patience, and she said, "Then I'll wait outside." I stood there with the cold coming in around my hand. Then I opened the door the rest of the way and she came in past me, set the box down on the low table where I keep the coffee maker, and unbuttoned her coat like she'd been in that room 100 times. I didn't understand what was happening. I want to be honest about that from the start. Looking back, she had already made up her mind somewhere on the walk down Fox Street, probably before that, probably weeks before, and I was the last person in the building, in the neighborhood, maybe in the state of Maine to figure it out. My name is Elias Warren. I'm 41. I restore pianos in Portland, mostly uprights and the occasional grand, out of a ground floor shop on Fox Street with a loading door big enough to get a Steinway B through if you take the legs off first and don't mind sweating. Regulate actions. I replace hammers and bridle straps and dampers. I do a lot of work nobody ever sees, inside a case that gets closed again and forgotten. The job rewards a certain temperament. If you're off by 0.004 of an inch on a let-off, a good player will feel it in the third measure and never be able to tell you why. I like that. I like that the standard is exact and nobody argues with it. Above the shop there's an apartment with slanted ceilings and one window that looks out over rooftops toward the water. I share it with Rafa, who I've known since we were both 19 and broke and living on rice. Rafa crews on a groundfish boat that runs 8 and 10-day trips out of the fish pier. He's gone more than he's home, and when he's home he sleeps for 2 days and then eats everything in the refrigerator. He put a hand on my shoulder at the worst moment of my life and didn't say anything, which was exactly right, and I'll owe him for that until one of us dies. The worst moment of my life was 2 years and 4 months before that Friday. I was engaged to Vivienne. 3 weeks before the wedding she sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded and told me she'd realized she was marrying a man who had already decided how his life was going to go. She said it like she was diagnosing me. We lost the deposit on the venue in Falmouth, $1,100, non-refundable, and I remember that number better than I remember most of what she said because it was the one part of the whole thing that had a clean edge to it. She wasn't cruel. That's the part people don't believe. She was just done, and she was very organized about being done. After she left, I went back to work, and work is what I had. I got up at 5:30. I ran the loop around Back Cove 3 or 4 mornings a week, past the treatment plant, past the guys fishing off the bridge, all the way around while the sun came up behind the hill. I cooked most nights because restaurant noise had started to feel like standing too close to a speaker. Weekends I'd take an old upright apart down to the plate and put it back together, or I'd rebuild something for myself just to keep my hands busy. That spring I redid the finish on a 1948 console nobody had asked me to touch, French polish, 20 coats because the rhythm of it kept my head quiet. 2 years of that. I want to be clear, I wasn't miserable. I told anyone who asked that I was fine, and mostly I meant it. I just had a very specific idea of what the rest of my life was going to look like, and there was no door in it. In the bottom drawer of my workbench, under the shims and the felt punchings, there's a tuning fork. Steel, A44, stamped with a maker's name you'd have to hold up to the light to read. It was my father's. He tuned pianos for 36 years in Bangor, and he taught me to strike it against my knee, not the bench, and to listen for the moment the beat disappears. I hadn't struck it since the year he died. I used an electronic tuner like everybody else now, and I told myself that was just efficiency. You're going to hear about that fork again, more times than I'd like to admit. The I'd met 4 months before that Friday. There's a church on the peninsula, Granite, 1889, with a Halliday Davis upright in the parish hall that hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. The committee hired me to make it playable. Water had gotten into the case at some point and the pin block was tired, and I spent 3 weeks in that cold hall with a space heater and a thermos. Thea came in on a Tuesday afternoon with a milk crate of hymnals that had been in the same flooded closet. She was the conservator at the Historical Society, on loan to the church for pennies because she said the 1902 hymnals had marginalia worth saving. Somebody had penciled the names of soldiers next to certain hymns. She walked over while I had the action out on sawhorses, looked at the exposed hammers and asked, "Are the originals worth keeping, or is that sentiment?" Most people ask if I can make it sound nice. Most people ask how much. She asked the only question that mattered, on the first try, and I remember I sat back on my heels and actually looked at her for the first time. She was 35, dark hair she kept twisting up and losing, a scar on her left thumb from a scalpel. She drank chamomile tea out of a chipped mug she brought from home, and she'd hold it with both hands even when it wasn't cold. She spoke slowly. Not shy slowly, deliberately, like each word cost her something and she wasn't going to spend one she didn't mean. When she was thinking, she'd press her tongue against the inside of her cheek and stare at the middle distance, and you could have set off a car alarm and she wouldn't have blinked. She made a joke that first week about hide glue, smelling like a wet dog, and I laughed. Out loud, in the shop, in front of a customer's instrument. I hadn't done that in 2 years, and the sound of it startled me more than the joke deserved. Rafa met her once. He came by the church to help me move the piano back against the wall, and afterward in the truck he said, "She watched you the whole time you were talking about the pin block. Nobody watches anybody that long about a pin block." I told him he'd been at sea too long. He laughed and let it go, and it turned out he was right about all of it, and it turned out he knew a lot more than he was saying. So, that Friday, Thea took her coat off and told me she needed clamps. The Society's book press was in the annex, and the annex had been torn open for asbestos abatement, and there was a hymnal with a broken spine that couldn't wait another 6 weeks in a humid basement. She had brought it in a gray archival box. She said she needed cauls, clamps, and a flat surface, and she said she'd bring her own paste. Now, it was 9 o'clock at night. There is a hardware store on Forest Avenue. There is a bookbinder in Yarmouth. There were, I would later count, at least 4 ways to solve her problem that did not involve walking 11 blocks in the rain to a shop that was closing. I said, "Rafa's out on the water. He doesn't get in until Thursday." I've thought about that sentence more than I've thought about almost anything I've ever said. Because she hadn't asked about Rafa. She hadn't said his name. I offered him up out of nowhere, the way a man puts a chair between himself and a dog. What I was doing, and I couldn't have told you this at the time, was giving her an exit. I was building her a reason to be there that wasn't me. Because if it was me, then I'd have to do something about it, and I had spent 2 years making sure I never had to do anything about anything. Thea looked at me for a second too long. Then she said, "Okay," and she opened the box. We worked. I cleared the bench, which I do not do for people, and set out the deep throat clamps and cut cauls out of quarter-sawn maple scrap, and she pared a strip of new leather so thin you could read a newspaper through it. She showed me the pencil in the back of the hymnal, a woman's handwriting from 1918, 3 names and a date. She said her whole job was making sure a stranger 100 years from now could still read what somebody's grandmother wrote in a margin at 4 in the morning. She wasn't rushing. That's the thing I noticed and dismissed. When we'd worked at the church, there'd been a rhythm to it. Decide, move, done. That night she took her time. She told me she chose conservation over curating, because curators talk about objects and conservators touch them. She told me her mother grew rosemary in clay pots on a porch in Camden and dragged them inside every October because rosemary won't survive a Maine winter, and that her mother did this for 30 years without once complaining about it, and that this was the closest thing to a religion in their house. She told me she'd been in love with a man in Boston for 6 years who never once asked her a question about her work. Then she stopped and looked at the hymnal and didn't say anything else about that. Around 11 the glue was setting, and neither of us had eaten. I made toast, because that's what I had, and I put 2 eggs in simmering water and pulled them at 6 minutes so the yolks were still soft, and I set them on the toast with butter and cracked pepper and a little salt. It's what my father used to make when he came home late from a job. She ate all of it standing up, leaning against the bench, and she said, "This is the best thing anybody's given me in a year." And I laughed, and she said, "I'm not joking," and she wasn't. Somewhere in there she asked me about the piano I keep in the corner, my own, a beat-up 1927 Chickering I'll never finish. I told her more than I meant to. I'm not good at talking about myself. I've always been better at listening, and people mistake that for kindness when a lot of the time it's just cover. But standing in my shop at midnight with the space heater ticking and the foghorn going somewhere out past the islands, I understood one thing clearly. Thea did not tell these stories to many people. She was choosing to tell them to me. I registered the fact of it. I did not do anything with it. I filed it, the way I file a measurement. Here's what I didn't know then, and what you've probably already worked out. She'd asked Rafa about the boat schedule, not that night 2 weeks earlier, at the church, while they were carrying hymnals out to her car. Just conversation. When's your next trip? How long are you gone? He barely noticed the question. She'd known before she left work that Friday that the building above my shop would be empty and that nobody was going to come down the stairs asking who wanted a beer. The hymnal was real. The broken spine was real. The abatement was real, but she could have called me Monday. She could have called the bindery. She walked 11 blocks in October rain and knocked on a locked door at 9 o'clock at night, and when I gave her a way out, she said okay and stayed anyway. Let me back up and fill in the parts I got wrong while they were happening. There was a morning at the church in August when the humidity was so bad the sanctuary smelled like an old boat. I was setting the temperament and I'd gotten the middle octave where I wanted it, and Thea came in and stood by the door. I played an octave and let it ring. She said, "That one's honest, Ak." I asked her what she meant. She said it stopped arguing with itself. I have been around musicians my entire life and not one of them has ever described a clean unison better than that. There was an afternoon in September when I got stuck on the phone for 50 minutes with a customer in Cape Elizabeth who wanted to know why her piano wouldn't hold a tuning in a house where she ran the wood stove at 80 degrees. By the time I hung up, I was ready to drive into the ocean. When I turned around, there was a mug of chamomile tea on the corner of my workbench still hot. No note, nobody in the shop. I have to explain why that mattered. I don't let anyone put anything on my bench. It's not a preference, it's closer to a compulsion. There are tools on that bench in an order that means something, and when Vivienne and I lived together she learned inside of a month not to set her keys down on it, because I would say something, and then she would say something. And then we'd both be up until 1 in the morning, discussing what kind of man needs a whole bench to himself. Thea put a mug on my bench and I picked it up and drank it and never said a word. I didn't consciously decide to allow it. It just never occurred to me to mind. And there was the night of the committee meeting in the parish hall, folding chairs, bad coffee, 7 people arguing about whether to spend $11,000 on a piano or $4,000 on a sound system. They asked me to explain what I'd done. I stood up and talked about the pin block and the crown of the soundboard, and how a 130-year-old instrument in that room would outlive every speaker they could buy. And halfway through I looked up and Thea was at the far end of the table with her chin in her hand, watching me the way you watch something you already believe in. When I sat down, she gave me one small nod. It was not for the room. Nobody else at that table saw it, and if they had, they wouldn't have known what they were looking at. I told myself it was nothing, and I carried it around for a month. Here's the part I've never told anyone. 2 weeks before that Friday, I asked her to dinner. I stood in the parish hall with a tuning hammer in my hand like an idiot, and I said there was a place on Commercial Street I liked, and I asked if she wanted to go on Thursday. She said I can't. That's all. No reason. No rescheduling, nothing. She looked away when she said it, and she left about 10 minutes later, and I spent the drive home doing what men like me do, which is take a 2-word answer and build an entire structure on top of it. She's being polite. She's letting me down easy. Don't do that again. I actually said that out loud in the truck. Don't do that again, Elias. What I found out much later was that on that Thursday her mother had gone down the porch steps in Camden and broken her hip, and Thea had spent the night in a hallway at Penn Bay Medical Center. And she didn't tell me because we weren't anything yet, and she wasn't going to make me responsible for her mother. She told me later she got in her car in that parking lot at 2 in the morning and thought about calling me and decided she didn't have the right. So when people say I moved slow, they're right, but it wasn't 4 months of a man staring at a wall. It was 4 months of a man who tried once, misread the answer, and put his hands back in his pockets. Back to that Friday. Close to 1 in the morning, the glue set, the hymnal clamped. We sat on the 2 mismatched stools by the chickering, and neither of us said anything for a long while. And it was the good kind of quiet, the kind where nobody's rummaging for something to say. The heater ticked. A truck went by on Fox Street, and the window buzzed the way it does. Thea was looking at the fallboard. She said, "Can I ask you something strange?" "Sure, do you think a thing can be finished and still not be done?" I said I didn't follow. She said I take a book apart and I put it back together and it looks the way it looked in 1902 and it functions, and everybody's happy. But every single time there's something I could have done that I didn't do, because I ran out of nerve, or time, or because it wasn't my call. The book's finished. It isn't done. She turned the mug in her hands. I said, "All the time." She waited. She gave me the whole silence. She let it sit there for probably 8 seconds, which is an eternity, and she was not asking about books, and both of us knew it, and I let it pass. I said something about the chickering. She smiled a little, just the corners, and put her mug down. At the door she stopped and looked at the row of tuning hammers hanging on their pegs, and then at the drawer under the bench, which was open about 2 inches because I'd been digging for punchings. She said, "Is that a fork?" I said it was my father's. She said, "When's the last time you used it?" I didn't answer. She nodded like I had, and she pulled her coat closed, and she said, "You should," and she went out into the rain. I stood there for a while afterward. The shop smelled like chamomile and hide glue. It was quieter than it had been before she came, and not in a restful way. 2 weeks went by and neither of us named anything. She came to the shop on a Sunday because she'd found a walnut end table at an estate sale and wanted to know if the split in the top was worth fixing. I said no and then spent 4 hours fixing it. We walked the Eastern Promenade on a Saturday when the wind was coming off the bay hard enough to make your ears ache, and we went the whole length of it, twice, because we kept finding new things to argue about. Whether a repair should be visible, whether old furniture is genuinely better, or whether we only ever see the survivors, whether the water in Casco Bay in November is technically capable of killing you in 11 minutes. She said it depends on the man. We hadn't touched, not once. Not a hand on an arm, nothing, but the distance between us kept getting measured in things other than inches, in the extra half second at the end of a look, in the way she'd stop talking mid-sentence and wait for me to catch up. Rafa came in off a 10-day trip, found a chipped mug in the drying rack that wasn't ours, and grinned at me over his coffee and said absolutely nothing for 4 days. Then Vivienne came back. She walked into the shop on a Wednesday afternoon in a camel coat with her hair done, and she told the guy from the sign company who was measuring my window that she was my fiancée. Present tense. I heard it from the back room. That's Vivienne in one sentence. She said she needed to talk. I said we could talk right there, and I stayed on my side of the bench, and she stood on hers. She told me she'd been thinking about the wedding. She said walking away had been the single worst decision she'd ever made. She said she'd spent 2 years around men who talked constantly and meant nothing, and that I was the only person she'd ever met who said a thing once and then did it. Her voice broke on the word steady. It was very well done. If I'd heard it 18 months earlier, I'd have folded like a card table. But I'd spent 2 years learning the difference between someone who misses you and someone who misses being wanted by you. I know that difference now the way I know a false beat in a unison. I let her finish. I told her no. I told her plainly, without heat, and she smiled a little and said, "You've gotten harder." And I said, "I've gotten quieter," and I thought that was the end of it. Then I made the mistake of walking her to the door, and while we were standing there, Thea came in from the street with a cardboard tray and 2 teas, and she stopped when she saw us, and she said hello very politely, and she set one of the cups on the corner of my workbench and left. Vivienne watched her do it. I want you to understand what Vivienne saw. She didn't see a woman bring a man tea. She saw a woman put a cup down on Elias Warren's bench, and Elias Warren not say a word about it, and she understood in about a second and a half exactly what that meant, because she had lived inside my rules for 4 years and she knew where every one of them was. She said, "Huh," and she left. What happened next was surgical, and the worst part is she never had to lie more than once. She found Thea in the parking garage on Street Elms to work on a Friday. No witnesses, no easy way to walk off, and she told her the truth mostly. That's what made it work. She said, "Elias and I have been talking again." True. She had come to talk. The phrasing does all the damage. She said, "He's never said your name to me, not once." Also true. I hadn't said Thea's name to Vivienne because Vivienne no longer had any right to know who mattered to me. And then she said, "He still has the ring, bottom drawer of the workbench under the felt, go look if you want." That was the lie. And it was a beautiful lie, because it was specific, and because she knew the one place in the world I'd let no one look. I'd sold that ring 18 months earlier at a pawn shop on Congress Street. $820. I walked out with the cash in my coat pocket and ordered a rosewood handle and used the rest on rent, and I have used that hammer every working day since, but Thea had no way of knowing that, and Vivienne bet everything on the gap. Thea didn't confront me. There was no phone call, no accusation, no scene. She simply stopped. The tea stopped. The texts stopped. The ones at 10 at night about a bindery in Rockland, about a barred owl she saw on the prom, about nothing. She sent one email, On a Monday, subject line hymnal, 3 sentences, thanking me for the use of the clamps and letting me know the spine had held. She used my last name in it. I didn't understand. I thought I'd done something at the church. I went back through everything, every conversation, the way I'd go through a regulation job looking for the one screw I forgot to turn. I found nothing. You don't notice the size of a light until somebody switches it off. My bench looked wrong every morning. The corner where the mug went stayed empty, and I kept setting my coffee somewhere else, because putting it there felt like sitting in a dead man's chair. The parish hall was just a cold room again. I'd catch chamomile somewhere, a coffee shop, a grocery aisle, and my whole chest would go tight over a bag of dried flowers. 3 weeks of that. Then Rafa came in off a trip. He dropped his bag inside the door, and he didn't shower, and he didn't eat, which for Rafa is a 5-alarm bell. He sat down on the stool across the bench and said, "I ran into Thea at the market on Wednesday." I said, "And?" He said, "Your ex went after her. In a parking garage. Told her you two were back together and that you've still got the ring in that drawer." He pointed at the drawer with his chin. "Thea told me she wasn't going to stand between 2 people. She said that's not who she is." She said it like she'd rehearsed it about 40 times. I put my hands flat on the bench, and then Narafa told me the rest, everything he'd been sitting on. He told me Thea had asked him about the boat schedule 2 weeks before that Friday night, and that it had taken him about 4 days to understand why. He told me she'd cornered him at the church that same week and asked him, straight out, whether I was seeing anybody, and whether I ever talked about Vivienne, and whether he thought I was the kind of man who'd notice if a woman was standing right in front of him. He told me she'd asked him not to say anything to me. She said if it was going to happen, it wasn't going to happen, because somebody told me to look. And Rafa, who has never in his life been able to keep a secret about a Red Sox trade, kept that one for 4 months because she asked him to, and because he thought she was right. He said, "She was right too, except you were never going to look." I sat on that stool and everything from the previous 4 months slid into place at once, like tumblers in a lock that's finally being turned by correct key. The tea on the bench. The one nod at the committee table. Do you think a thing can be finished and still not be done? The 11 blocks in the rain, then I'll wait outside. The way she'd looked at the open drawer and said you should. Every person in my life had been watching this happen for months. I was the last one in the room to know. I got up and pulled the drawer all the way out and dumped it on the bench. Shims, punchings, a broken key bushing, 3 pencils. And the fork. I picked it up. It was cold and heavier than it looks, the way steel always is. I struck it against my knee, the way Father taught me, and set the stem of the bench, and the whole shop filled up with that pure single tone. No vibrato, nothing to argue with. It went on for a long time. I stood there listening to a note that has not changed since before I was born and will not change after I'm gone, and one thought came through everything I'd built around myself. I have kept this door locked for 2 years and called it a house. Thea rented the top floor of a house on Sheridan Street, up on the hill, a narrow staircase that announces you 3 flights before you arrive. I drove over on a Thursday after work without calling. There were 4 clay pots of rosemary on her landing, waiting to be brought in before the frost, and I smelled them before I got to the door. She opened it and looked at me, and there was no surprise on her face at all. Not relief, not anger, not the coldness I'd braced for. She looked at me the way you look at a package you've been expecting for a while without knowing the day. I didn't work up to it. I knew if I gave myself 20 seconds I'd lose my nerve and start talking about hymnals. I said, "Vivienne came to the shop." I told her no in the first 3 minutes and she left. "There's no ring in that drawer. I sold it at the pawn shop on Congress 18 months ago, $820, and I bought the tuning hammer I use every day and paid part of November's rent. The receipt is in my toolbox. I'll go get it right now if you want to see it." I took a breath. "And I never said your name to her because she doesn't get to know about you." Thea leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms. Not defensive. It's the way people hold themselves when they want badly to believe something, and they're deciding whether they're allowed to. She said, "Why didn't you say anything, Elias?" 4 months, I said. "Because I asked you to dinner and you said you couldn't, and I decided that was the whole answer. Because I've been wrong before about what people meant. And I would rather have had nothing than have been wrong about you." She closed her eyes for a second. Then she said quietly, "My mother fell down the porch stairs that day. I was in Rockport in a hallway until 6 in the morning. Neither of us said anything for a while. Somewhere below us a car went by with a bad muffler. Then she laughed, one breath of it with something sad underneath that made it more honest than any laugh I've ever heard. She said, "I walked 11 blocks in the rain to your locked shop at 9 o'clock at night to borrow clamps." "Clamps, Elias. There's a hardware store 4 minutes from my apartment." She shook her head slowly. "You told me your roommate was out on the water. Did you honestly think I came there to see Rafa?" I stood in that doorway with Rosemary on the cold air, and every single thing I'd missed came back at once. The mug on the bench, the nod across the table, the questions she'd asked me carefully, over and over, that I answered by changing the subject. She had waited 4 months. She'd have waited longer. She'd been more patient with me than anyone in my life ever has been, including my father, who once spent an entire summer teaching me to hear a beat I couldn't hear. I said, "I'm not good at this. I can hear 4/1000ths of an inch. I can hear when a unison's wrong from across a room, and I could not hear you standing directly in front of me telling me something for 4 months. I stopped, but I know one thing. Since you stopped putting a cup on that bench, I've looked at that corner every morning. I tried setting my coffee there once, it was wrong. Nothing else fits," she said. I told myself I wasn't going to keep knocking. "I know, I meant it. I know you meant it," I said. "That's why I drove over here." She stepped forward and put her hand flat on my chest, over the sternum, light steady. Her palm was warm through my shirt. It was the first time in 4 months we had touched each other, and I felt it land the way you feel a note finally stop arguing with itself. There was one more thing I had to do before anything could start. I met Vivienne 2 days later at a coffee place on Congress, midday, full of people, nowhere for anything to become theatrical. She'd already ordered. She started talking as soon as I sat down, and she'd clearly worked on the opening. I held up a hand. I said, "You went to Thea in a parking garage and told her the ring was in my bench. It's been in a pawn shop for a year and a half. You knew that wasn't true and you said it anyway, and you picked the drawer because you knew I'd never let anyone look in it. And that's the part I can't get past. Not the leaving, the aim." She started to answer and I stood up. I said, "You signed your name in August 2 years ago. I signed mine the same afternoon. That was the end of it. And there's no revision. Don't come to my shop again." Her eyes filled. She cried. And I'd lived with her long enough to know the difference between grief and losing a negotiation. She wasn't mourning a man she loved. She was mourning a version of her life she'd assumed was still in inventory. I put a 10 on the table for both coffees and walked out into the cold, and I did not turn around, and out on the sidewalk the sun was so bright off the wet pavement that I had to stand there a second with my eyes shut. That night I sat at the kitchen table upstairs under the bad overhead light and cleaned my father's tuning fork with a cloth and a little polish, working slowly, the way I'd rub out a finish, taking off one layer of tarnish at a time until the steel came up bright enough to throw the light back at me. It had been in a drawer for 11 years. It rang exactly the same as the day he bought it. That's the entire point of the thing. 3 weeks later, Thea started coming over on Friday nights with no excuse at all. No archival box, no clamps, no reason. She'd show up with a grocery bag from the Hannaford on Marginal Way and a plan. Roast chicken with too much lemon. A pot of chili in December that we ate for 4 days. Once a haddock chowder that took her an hour and a half and was better than anything I've paid $30 for on the waterfront. I washed, she dried, a towel over her shoulder, humming something I never did identify. Rafa would be on the couch with a paperback, and every so often, he'd look up at the two of us moving around that kitchen without bumping into each other, and he'd shake his head and go back to his book. We never announced anything. We never sat down and defined it. We just started, the way real things start, without a label, until the pattern gets so obvious that saying it out loud would only make it smaller. 2 months in, I drove her up to Camden on a Saturday to meet her mother. It was the 3rd week of October, and there were 4 clay pots on the porch, and 3 of them were already inside the door, and I could smell the rosemary from the driveway. Her mother came out on the steps, a woman in her late 60s with Thea's exact way of pausing before she answered anything, and she looked at me, and then at her daughter, and then back at me. She said, "She's told me a great deal about you. I pictured you louder." Thea turned the color of a brick. I laughed the way you laugh when it comes out of you before you can decide whether to allow it, and her mother made a pot roast, and then interrogated me for 40 minutes, whether it was how true that pianos have to be tuned to the room, and she understood the answer faster than half the musicians I've worked for. 4 months in, the church asked us to finish what we'd started. The piano was done, but there were 60 hymnals and a clotet and a fundraiser to run. We worked it together, openly, no pretense. I built the display cases and she did the books, and the whole parish committee had figured us out long before either of us said a word. One of the deacons told me over coffee. We had a pool going. Bill won. He said Thanksgiving. 6 months after that Friday, Rafa moved out. He'd taken a shore job with the co-op and put money down on a place in Portland with a garage. The night before the truck came, we sat at the counter drinking beer and talking about nothing, which is what men do when a chapter is closing, and neither of them wants to say so. When his bottle was empty, he got up, went down the stairs into the shop, and came back with the batooningest. He said, set it on the counter between us. He said, you know who ought to have this. Then he pulled me into a hug, not the 2 slaps on the back kind, the real thing, the kind 2 men give each other when they've come through a bad stretch of road, and both of them are still on their feet. 9 months in, Thea moved her things over. It wasn't a decision so much as an acknowledgement of something that had already happened without a vote. Her toothbrush was there. Her reading glasses were on the nightstand next to mine. Her shampoo had been on the shower shelf since February. She brought the rosemary up from Sheridan Street and put the pots in the window over the sink, where the morning light lands first, and she dragged them in from the fire escape every October after that, 30 years behind her mother and gaining. She had the original spine of that hymnal, the broken one, the piece she'd replaced and kept because conservators never throw away what they take off, mounted in a shallow frame and hung it in the hallway by the door. Cracked brown leather, 4 inches long, the gold stamping almost gone. I stood in front of it a long time the day she hung it, and I didn't say anything. It's the only thing in the apartment I look at every single day. 1 year to the day after she knocked on my locked door with a box under her arm, and a reason she never once admitted was a pretext. We walked the Eastern Prom on a Sunday afternoon. Same route, same unhurried pace, same long stretches of not talking, broken up by remarks about the light on the water or somebody's dog chasing a gull it was never going to catch. There's a bench about 2/3 of the way down with a bronze plaque on it. Thea had transcribed that plaque 3 years earlier for the Historical Society when the letters had gone green and nobody could read the name of the man it was dedicated to. She'd figured out who he was. A pilot boat captain, drowned in 1911. She's quietly proud of that one. I stopped at that bench and took a small box out of my jacket pocket. Inside was my father's tuning fork, polished until it looked new, threaded onto a fine silver chain. I said this was his, and then it sat in a drawer for 11 years, and then you asked me when I'd last used it. It doesn't make any music. It can't. All it does is tell everything around it what true sounds like. I had to stop for a second. That's what you did. I'd like you to keep it. Thea took it out of the box and closed her hand around it, and her eyes were wet, and she was smiling in a way that held about 6 things at once. The waiting and the wanting and the plain relief of finally arriving somewhere she'd been walking toward longer than I ever knew. She said, that night I brought the hymnal, because if you'd turned me away, I'd still have had a reason for being there. I could have told myself it was work. I had the whole thing planned out. And you opened the door and you said Rafa was on the water and I almost left. I said, why didn't you? Because you cleared your bench, she said. You moved every tool on it. I'd watched you not let a deacon set a coffee cup on that bench, and you cleared it for a broken hymnal. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. And then you made me an egg, I said. 6 minutes, soft yolk. I know, she said. I remember. The wind came up off the bay and a ferry went by out toward the islands, and somewhere behind us a kid was yelling about something that mattered enormously to him and to nobody else. Here's what I've come to think. Vivian didn't take my faith in love when she left. That's the easy story and it isn't true. What she took was quieter than that. She took my willingness to be wrong in front of somebody. For 2 years I built a routine and called it peace. It wasn't peace. It was a room I'd sealed up so nothing could get in and knock anything over. And Thea didn't come to tear that down. She never tried to fix me. She never told me I was broken, or hurting, or hiding, and she never once used the word closed off, which I would not have survived. She came because she'd already looked at me carefully and decided nothing about me needed correcting. She just wanted the door open, and when I wouldn't open it, she stood outside in the rain and waited. And when she finally said she wouldn't keep knocking, she meant that too, and I believe with everything I have that she'd have walked away and lived a full life and never told a soul. She wears the fork on the chain, under her shirt, where nobody sees it. But sometimes in the evening when she's reading on the couch or standing at the window with the rosemary, she reaches up and touches it with 2 fingers, just for a second. Whatever it means to carry the exact pitch of a true thing against your skin, she carries it. And I notice every time, and I have never said so. So if somebody knocks after you've locked up, holding a reason you both know is not the reason, don't ask them what they really want. Don't make them say it. Unlock the door. Clear a space on the bench. Put 2 eggs in the water. Has anyone ever come to you with an excuse when the real thing was something neither of you could say out loud? Is there a door you've kept locked so long you've stopped calling it a door? If this one found you, leave a like. Send it to somebody who's been sitting alone in a quiet room and calling it peace. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Tell me your answer in the comments. I read every one of them.